I want to start with something a little lighter, which is, even though it's overall irrelevant in the main story, I love the genre break that it takes in chapter 3 with the LARPing section. I think it's so clever, and it's an easy way for Square Enix to flex their RPG chops in a narrative setting that makes sense.
Yeah, I love the LARP so much. I think that it took away resources from like the ending of the game probably and made everything else maybe less interesting and flatter. And there's some foreshadowing too for the ultimate villain of the game in terms of you face off with, which I only saw in hindsight, and I was like, this is so cleverly done.
Yes.
It's amazing.
The other thing that I really like about the idea of the LARP section is that the entire town basically totally commits to it. One of the things that I think makes the setting so likable is their willingness to just submit to the LARPing and submit to the chaos just to basically make this one kid feel better. It just makes every single character in the village so much more likable as a result.
Yeah. Oh, I also love that. I think My Block is what it's called, as their version of Facebook on your phone. Yeah. You can check. Some guy was like, "Hey, can I join this? I don't know what's going on. Is it too late?" And then Steph was like, "Yeah, we're real deep in it now, dude. Sorry, maybe next year."
Yeah.
Or next time. But and also when you're about to go to the Serpent, there's like 2 NPCs on the street, and they're like talking to each other. One guy is like, "I'm so bored," and then the woman's like, "Shh, they're coming. We have to stay in character."
The entire section was just so adorable. And like, the only qualm that I have about it is that it kind of is irrelevant in the overall plot of the story. I actually also sort of just enjoyed the battle system, as dumb as that sounds. It's not like the most robust thing, but it was still fun.
Stirring him. Double Feanor's next attack.
The moment at the end of it though, when Ethan is so joyous that you kind of like capture his, like Alex takes his energy and like now the whole thing has transformed into a real RPG. I was just so blown away by that. I was like, oh my God, it's amazing.
Yeah, I guess it is sort of foreshadowing for like how Alex's power evolves. So like in that regard, it is kind of narratively useful. But it also made me kind of just like wish that an entire game would take place in that setting, because it looked amazing. And like, it would be kind of cool to like do something a little different with Life is Strange and like take place in medieval times, for example, or something. So
yeah, it was definitely like the highlight of the game, but also irrelevant to the rest of it. So if it could be incorporated a bit more and better, that would just elevate the whole game itself. You're also hinting at some other choices that you make later on. I'm curious what you chose for them. Like with Charlotte, for instance, what did you choose?
At that point in the game, that was the first choice where we really had to think about it a lot, because there's a lot of ethical implications involved with it, and whether or not it is even the intelligent thing to do for a person's well-being. The game eventually presents you with this choice after you, as Alex, see that this character, Charlotte, who just lost her boyfriend and has to take care of her kid, who she actually blames for her boyfriend's death, has just like this crazy rage that's building in her, and a lot of self-hatred on her as well, because like there are various lines that you hear where she says like, how did I become this monster? I'm such a bad mother, like, and just like a lot of these like really hard things to hear in a video game. But Alex presents this choice of like, wow, this is like a really seething hatred. I don't know if I should just leave this alone, because like she might do something with it. And so like, do I take away that anger and that hatred for her so that she can feel better, or do I let her stew in it? That's an interesting choice. That was like the first choice that the game had presented me, where I was just like, okay, I have to think about this a little bit. This is cool. And I chose to let her stew with it. I didn't let Alex take away that.
I saw this moment. I didn't realize the implications. I mean, I knew that, you know, it'd be better for her to process the emotions, but I was also so worried about what she would do in her anger. Maybe she will kill somebody, I don't know. So I was really worried about Charlotte. It's like, I have to watch after her. And I also thought, you know, Alex is evolving her powers. What are they for? They must be for something. Let me use her powers. So I took away Charlotte's anger. I will have to say you made the right choice.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Because
okay. What happens?
If you take away Charlotte's anger, Alex gets really angry, and she takes it out on Ryan and Charlotte. So she ends up like throwing the foosball championship whiskey into the wall.
Oh no.
And she's just like, you know, I have had it. And then Steph is like, you know what? I don't have to take this. I don't have to sit here listening to you like abuse us with your shouting. So she runs away, and so does Ryan. But the thing about this game is that I don't think it really transitioned fully well, because after that, Alex is just back to normal again. And she's like, all right, time to investigate Typhon. That's the other thing, is Charlotte becomes like a shell of a person. Like the more you talk to her after that, she's like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I don't know where I am. And I don't know how I'm feeling anymore.
So that was one of my major concerns about taking away her anger, because I was like, is it essentially performing a lobotomy on a person? For me, I was wondering, if I take away Charlotte's anger, am I taking away something that is an essential part of her? And am I changing her persona permanently? But she believed me at the end, which I was really surprised about. I thought for sure she'd be too angry to believe me. Here's where the game is weird to me. I tried to stay consistent with that idea, where it was just like, I'm not going to take away people's emotions. I'm going to let them feel it. I'm going to let them process it, and I'm just going to move on. And so when the game presents you with another opportunity to do that with a character, Pike, taking away his fear, I was like, you know what? Like, he's just got to stew in his fear. That's it. Like it's part of who he is. Like, I'm not going to change his character. And he didn't believe me at the end when I tried to like get him on my side, and probably because he was too scared of retaliation. And that was weird to me, because I was like, well, is the game trying to say that you should process your emotions? Because that's what they're saying with Charlotte, but they're not saying that with Pike.
Yeah, I think the game is trying to leave it ambiguous. It's not really telling you way or the other is correct. But in the case of Pike, it's very clear that if you take away his fear, that's the right choice. If you take away his fear, then he believes you. His fear is what's keeping him from taking down Typhon, but it's really like he does believe in your cause, and he is trying to be the good guy there. So the game is just not trying to have one right answer.
That's interesting, because I think that what the game explains is that because Alex was forced into this like really bad situation with her family, where she had to be the solid rock for her brother and her father amidst a tragedy with her mother, and she didn't have the space to actually feel her feelings or like process her emotions. Because of that, she endured a lot of issues growing up, and like, you know, hopped from family to family, and current present day has issues approaching really strong emotions like anger or fear from other people. I thought that like what the game was basically trying to say based off of that was like, okay, well, those types of emotions may suck and you might try to push them away, but it's important to feel them and process them to grow as people. They sort of also reinforce that with the main bad guy, who, spoiler alert, is Jed, where the final confrontation, which is basically just like a talk between Alex and Jed, she basically explains that like, oh yeah, I totally get why you tried to cover up your mistake. Like, you don't want to process your feelings about it. You don't want to admit it's a mistake. You hate yourself, but you don't want to talk about that. You want to think you're a hero. I thought that like those two things combined, with the game trying to say that like to be emotionally intelligent, you must confront your emotions.
The game itself, it's about not repressing your emotions. But then Pike is the policeman. And the reason why I took away his fear is because I see that Alex is trying to take down Typhon. And so the choice that would help her do that is to take away his fear and like kind of manipulate him a little bit, which is also wrong, right? But then the game is like, okay, go for it. Like, this is the way forward.
It goes back to what we were saying, which is that the mystery plot kind of overtakes the processing your emotions plot. And I don't know if it's necessarily for the better, but it definitely jumbles things.
You were so thrown off with Jed being the main villain. I was the same way, because he's such a nice guy the whole time. He's letting you stay at, on the apartment above his bar for free. He's just like an old dad figure, and then he just turns on you and decides to shoot you and kill you. And what is that? Like,
yeah, and I already see what the comment section and people are going to say, which is just that like, oh, the first game did that too with Jefferson. Like, you know, he was your teacher, and like you can see. But like, here's the thing about Jefferson and the difference between him and Jed, in my opinion. There are signs that lead to you believing that something is weird with Jefferson. Something's going on with him. You see all of his artwork that's won like prizes, and they look like really like out of it women that are underaged and like kind of underdressed, and like it's black and white, and you're just like, something weird is going on with these pictures. And so the game at least hints that something strange is going on with the character. With Jed, I didn't feel that at all.
Yeah, no, he's always hinted as a very good guy. Like, I went back and replayed the Spring Festival. He's standing there telling a great story to everyone. He looks so joyful. You can't even interact with him. That's just how unimportant he seems. Just like a side character fading into the background. And you also see that he was like a hero this whole time. And there's no like question of like, was he a hero though? Like, what? Yeah, he just comes out of nowhere. The only hint you get is that LARP where he's also the villain in that game.
The entire beginning sequence of chapter 5 is great. It's like peak Life is Strange and Square Enix in my mind. It's like things are getting loopy, things are getting a little weird. You don't really know what's going on in the story, but it's engaging and you just want to keep going and figure out what's happening. The ending sequence is a bunch of characters, and all of your choices are going to come into play as to whether or not the character that's about to speak will believe you.
It's very similar to, all the other games of this genre. The ending could have been longer. It was not satisfying. For the first time I played through it, I chose to leave Haven. But the second time I played and I stayed in Haven. And either way, it's still like these very short scenes and now it's over.
Yeah.
So I wasn't like very impressed with it, to be honest.
The talk that you have with Ghost Gabe changes a little bit depending on like who you've romanced and what you chose. But like otherwise, this sequence plays out entirely the same. Which is a little disappointing, honestly, because especially in 2, all of your choices lead up to one of 4 different endings that are drastically different. And it's cool to have conversations with your friends that say like, oh, actually, like this ending is best for the brothers because X. Whereas like you can have an entirely different opinion that's also valid and true. You can't really do that with this game.
I romanced Ryan on the second playthrough, and then Steph leaves town. So that's like the only major difference. Yeah. If you romance Steph, Ryan doesn't do anything. He's just like, cool, man, have fun. But Steph is like, I'm out of here. Like I was going to leave and tour the world anyway. I'm too good for this. And then you're like, one of my friends is gone. Well, we still have a couple more playthroughs to see, because if everybody believes us, or if no one believes us, it might change things.
Yes.
But I still think Typhon gets defeated, Jed confesses and all the other things. Your romance continues.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel too.
The fact that you fall down a mine and not die, I guess that's possible. Yeah, and did she get shot too and then fall down the whole mine and still lived? I was so shocked.
I was floored. To be fair, it looked like the bullet might have grazed her or something, which just makes Jed's character look stupider. Like, why wouldn't you confirm the kill? Like, what are you doing, dude?
He's right next to her and he missed. What do you mean?
It's absurd.
Do you feel like the 2 characters, Gabe especially and Alex, how is the representation in this game? How much does it matter that they're Asian, or is just like
is it just slapped on? Yeah.
I was so hyped for this game for so long, and especially seeing like a queer Asian American woman being at the forefront of the game, I felt like her heritage too, or like even her identity never really mattered and never became the focal point of the story, which is not to say that it has to be, but I just felt that, she could have been anybody, and the game is really like generic in that way.
Yeah, like, because like the series has always been really good about LGBTQ representation, right? But they're still working on representation of other races. And like last series, they tried a Latino race, and I thought that was sort of successful, except the father dies at the beginning. So it wasn't really an examination of that at all. Wait a minute, same situation here, where it's like, it's not an examination of Asian culture because the family gets torn apart at the beginning.
Yeah, I was a little shocked by that.
Gabe is a lot of the story hinges on whether or not you can form a connection with him in the first chapter before he dies. And I found myself being like, okay, he's cool, but I didn't like really understand who he was as a character until he shows up again in later chapters. And even at that point, he's not really even Gabe, right? Because like he might just be a figment of Alex's imagination.
Yeah, he might just be a memory. If you replayed chapter 1 and 2 a little bit more, you could probably get a bit more detail about Gabe's life. Because when he first gives Alex his apartment, I went around looking at all his things.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and you get the sense that he's like a dorky, fun person. But there's also the fact that he has like a juvenile delinquent history. Like he has committed crimes before. And what was that? And then you only get that in chapter 5. But it like adds an air of mystery to him. It only makes him look cooler. So again, he's just too perfect.
Because I had seen so much advertising, I knew that his death was coming, but I was surprised that he stayed alive for so long. Like I thought for sure that they would kill him off relatively quickly, but it's not, he doesn't die until the end of chapter 1.
They were trying to make us, like the developers were like, yes, if we give you a whole chapter of Gabe, you'll like them, you'll like him, and then it'll be more painful when he passes away. But yeah, I didn't really connect with him. I connected more with the characters who were sad about him.
Yes, me too. One thing I really appreciate about this game is that it really handles social anxiety well. It really handles how there's this secondary voice in your head that like tells you that you're garbage and you're worthless, and it tells you all these things that aren't true, but you just believe that it is because it's constantly saying that. Every time that Alex observes people with her power, the character that you're observing will say something that's like degrading to themselves. It doesn't seem like scripted, it seems like very authentic, which I really appreciated.
I think Life is Strange True Colors is worth playing. There are other games asking deeper questions about mental health, each of our own internal psyches, and how we get along with people. It is a lot shorter, or there is less variability than I would have liked. So that's what I'll say.
With chapter 5, it starts where they're going back to her therapist essentially, and she asks like, what have you learned up to this point so far? And like one of the things that you can answer was, I have to learn myself feel, I guess, and not to be afraid of those feelings. I feel like that's kind of like the thesis statement of this game. If you make mistakes, you have to feel your feelings around those mistakes and not be afraid of that. And so in that regard, I think it's a very important narrative to basically explain to gamers. So I also think that it's definitely worth playing, despite the shortcomings of the narrative at the end of the game.